My name is Henrik, and I'm a recovering capitalist. For many years, I worked in the international finance industry, and today I work on saving the welfare system. But what needs saving, really? I'm a product of the welfare system as much as anyone else in Scandinavia. It's an amazing thing. Free education, free healthcare, opportunities and equal access to so many services, almost universal access to services, at a scale where we take more things for granted than most modern countries are struggling with still to establish. So what needs fixing? Well, there are still problems that the modern welfare society has troubles dealing with. Today we see things like language training of migrants. How is it that we're in a situation today where to train all the migrants that want to and hopefully need to learn Swedish, we need 30,000 more Swedish teachers? How we ended up in that situation? Didn't we see this coming? What about mental health in youth? Why does 10% of young people 18 to 24 eat psychopharmaca? Why can they expect that a third of them will suffer clinical depression, anxiety, or stress over their lifetime at some point? Why is it that 6% of 15 to 24-year-olds are not participating in either education or employment or training of any kind? Why can't we fix these problems? This is an amazing system. My inquiry into these questions started with meeting this man. This is Larry. Larry's a billionaire. Larry's father invented radio cancer therapy, basically how you cure brain cancer. Nice thing. Larry built a company over 40 years that has almost half the world market for kind of radiation machines that fixes cancer. Good story. Larry, as billionaires do, is also or was the chairman of a large nonprofit for over a decade, working with homeless people. And when I was sitting across him, a steaming cup of Java coffee in hand, he explained to me that he was getting worried after 10 years working with this nonprofit, because he was seeing mental health issues, criminality, homelessness, and substance abuse at a scale and in a nature that the public system seemed completely unable to deal with. And so they were falling to the responsibility of this nonprofit. He was getting worried about the integrity of our welfare system, and he was curious to fix it. And there must have been something really weird in the coffee that day, because before I left the room I had 5 million euros and a mission from Larry to try and figure out what is falling between the cracks of the welfare system. Can it be fixed? And what might we do to contribute to that? But to understand what we're looking at, I want to talk about Tony. Tony's a great example of what's wrong with the system today and what's falling between the cracks. Let's say that Tony's 15 years old. Tony has undiagnosed ADHD. Tony doesn't know that, of course. Tony feels like he has trouble concentrating in school, that he comes into conflict with his teachers and his fellow students. He might experience some social problems. But Tony also experienced that when he smokes pot, he chills out a bit. And he kind of works a bit better in school and functions better socially. So Tony smokes pot. To fund that, Tony steals some stuff and sells it to fund this small-scale abuse. You can imagine that Tony's more than likely to run into the police at some point, or perhaps the social services. And this is where the real problem starts. When the social services meet Tony, they don't see a potentially undiagnosed ADHD that's causing all kinds of ripple effects. They see a kid with a substance abuse problem. They take their hands away and they send Tony to the medical services to get help with the substance abuse problem. But because the fundamental cause of Tony's problems is actually the undiagnosed ADHD, he's more likely than not to go back and forth between relapsing into abuse, run-ins with the police and so forth. And depending on his home situation and what his parents are doing and what the status of them are, it's actually quite likely that Tony will be placed in foster care in an institution. Seems like a very unnecessary story to happen, right? So how representative is Tony? There are 30,000 Tonys in Sweden today. At any given point in time, 30,000 people, young people, are placed in institutional foster care. It is an industry. Why? Because in Sweden we have a system. We trust the system and we trust institutions. And for the most part, that's a great thing and it really works. It does not work for Tony. But to understand why this happens to Tony, we have to understand this room. That's a council room of what you might expect to be like a regular city or municipality. We'll have them in one of these towns. Sitting down in one of these rooms one day, I spoke to a politician, and he told me something I will never forget and that fired the bejesus out of me as an entrepreneur. Because he said this: as a politician, I am not responsible for solving social problems. As a politician, I am not responsible for solving social problems. My responsibility is to take care of a system that provides welfare. You see the logic? He trusts the system. It's kind of a good thing. But if the system doesn't work, then what's he going to contribute to changing it? You can imagine how scared I became. Like, how many politicians do we have like this? But let's be kind to this politician, because he's probably trying to do the best he can, and he wants to contribute. When I've been traveling all over the country, meeting people working in public services, I've not once found a person that has not impressed on me in the way that they are engaged and curious for how they can contribute to society. There's so many impressive people out there, and so many unsung heroes of nurses and teachers and doctors and social workers that are literally carrying the entire system and especially holding the cracks together with their own health as a cost sometimes. Over 10% of public service workers are sick at any point in time. So we need to understand this room. And what happens in this room is a couple of things. So there's three problems, or three aspects of the kind of problems that fall between the cracks of the modern Scandinavian welfare system. Three things that they have in common. The first is that they are complex. Like Tony's challenge, it's not an education question, it's not a police question, it's not a social question, it's not a health question. It's a bit of all of them. So who's responsible for Tony? No one. Who takes responsibility for Tony depends on who at any given point in time is triggered by some sort of an event to reach out and kind of grab an arm around Tony. But he's going to go from responsible to responsible to responsible, different authorities over time. And more often than not, he's going to fall between the cracks of the system entirely sometimes. The other problem, and this means that because the problems are complex, they fall between the silos of different public authorities. And because they do that, it also means that there's no financing for Tony's problem per se. There's financing for social services, for health and other things, but not for fixing Tony's problem. It's difficult to negotiate the kind of funding that's needed to fix the kind of problems that go across silos. And what's even worse, for a lot of these types of problems, government can't even do it alone. It's not even possible. If you take homelessness, a lot of homeless people don't even want connection or contact with social services because they've stopped trusting them a long time ago. And then you need a non-profit that's much better at building relationships with them, for example. So to solve a lot of these problems, we need the collaboration between public, non-profit, and private sectors. The welfare system as we have it today would collapse in an instant if you took away the companies that hold it up, for example. But the problem with companies is that they only do what you pay them for, and more often than not, we're paying for hospital beds, not for healthier people. That's what you get. You get hospital beds, and maybe not so many healthier people. Nonprofits are great at meeting the individual where they are and meeting their needs, but they're bad at scaling up and reaching economic sustainability, which is the strength of the private sector. The public sector is amazing at these big, broad systems that give us equal access to services, but they are terrible at meeting an individual with a complex set of needs in the way that they need to be met as an individual in an individualized fashion. So what do? You start a conversation. When we started a conversation, oh, Lars disappeared. We started a conversation with a person in this room, Lars Stjernquist, who's a politician in a municipality in Norrköping in Sweden. Lars is a socialist politician. Now, what does a socialist politician have in common with a billionaire, you might wonder? Well, actually a couple of things. A billionaire philanthropist like Larry and Lars both want to positively impact people's lives. They both want to be smart about how they manage the resources that they have at their disposal and influence. And they both want to create examples that can live longer and further than what they do with their own hands. So we set out to do something together, and that was to create a proof of concept that these modern problems of the welfare system can be fixed. So what we did was that we created a social impact bond, or social outcomes contract. Now, what in God's name is that? It is a contract for social outcomes. It is a contract between a private investor and a public commissioner that wants services or innovations provided. That means that the private investor finances an implementation of something over a set period of time, where there is an agreement on what are the outcomes that are desirable, that might result in payment back to the investor. And the idea is that you run a new innovation, you test a new product. The private financier shares the risk with the public sector commissioner, and you try a new program over a couple of years. This secures the implementation of this project from the annual budget discussions of the local municipality. It saves it from elections that might change the political winds and priorities. So you get this fixed set of time, a fixed budget to really follow through on an implementation. And you agree from the outset, what does it take for this thing to be successful? How do we measure that? And that's usually two things. One are social metrics, that we can see that we're actually doing impact for people like Tony. And secondly, savings for the public administration. And the more savings that a project like this creates, it creates kind of like a budget that starts growing with the savings. And out of that budget, you can potentially repay the investor. And the logic of this thing is that you want something like 1 million euros goes in and 4 million euros gets saved. So it's kind of like a no-brainer to perhaps give back the investor their 1 million and perhaps a little interest above that. But that's the logic of how these things should work. So how do these things contribute to fixing welfare? Well, they enable us to collaborate across silos. They enable us to organize in flexible ways, to bring in nonprofits, to bring in public sector, to bring in private sector, to deliver services. They enable us to secure financing and support beyond these boundaries of annual budget discussions and elections. And we made a social outcomes contract for Tony in Norrköping. For 60 kids placed in foster care, we wanted to avoid them being replaced in institutions that just create a negative spiral for the individual and increasing costs for the local authority. So we put together a team that was mostly confined within the public sector, within the municipality, and we added some external tutoring services. And they were tasked with keeping an eye on and making sure that they knew everything about these kids and what they needed, and did everything they could to coordinate all the services of the municipality so that no one fell between the cracks of attention of different areas of the public service. It's still ongoing, so we don't know the final results yet. If it works, then we'll save money for the municipality and give much better opportunities for the children involved to live healthier, functional lives. If it works really well, we'll succeed in establishing them in schooling, which is a good proxy indicator that they are doing well in general. If it doesn't work, then we as investors take a piece of the hit. And Norrköping would have had the chance to try an innovation that they hopefully would have wanted to try anyway, but at less risk to the taxpayers' money. Social outcomes contracts are examples of solutions. It's not the end and all. It's an example of something that follows the criteria of how we solve the problems of modern welfare. But what's really the greater point here? This is a J-curve, so what economists would call the ninth wonder in the world after interest rates. And the logic of this, though, is quite compelling and strong. A small initial investment can potentially lead in certain cases, to a very long-term return. And here's the example. Think of Tony. Think if we could have caught Tony when he was in school and the AD was starting to act up. Imagine all the costs that will go into trying to support Tony over the course of a lifetime if he continues on a path of perhaps mental health, substance abuse, and criminality developing. Imagine that just 30,000 Swedish crowns or 3,000 euros, which is the cost of a neuropsychiatric evaluation, imagine that little investment in an early days in school could have saved all the costs of a lifetime of worries for Tony, not to mention the social situation and the cost of his life and the value of that. That's the logic of social investments. Social investments enable us to do early interventions in social problems so that government doesn't have to spend so much money on trying to fix stuff in later stages. They're still going to be responsible for doing everything they can to solve things that are complex and late stage. But if we do more early investments, then we can slowly shift the use of public resources towards that early investments. And if the logic works, the cost of later stage interventions goes down. And those are big, big costs. What we can do then is we can make the welfare system sustainable again. It's the idea of a proof of concept that we can increase quality of welfare and lower the cost at the same time. We don't have to lower the cost. We can just repurpose the money to do good elsewhere. But we have a tool to actually make welfare long-term sustainable. I think that's a worthwhile idea. That's why I've been spending a couple of years trying to work on it and create a proof of concept. And we need others to try similar things. There are about 100 contracts like this out there in the world. We've made the only one in Sweden. There's other things coming. There's other ones in Finland and Norway and Denmark. And we hope that this is something that will grow. So I ask for your support and curiosity to ask the questions that lead to the potential for more of these things to develop. Thank you very much.